Hello once again. You may notice that I've got a different background, and that's because in the middle of my recording, my daughter came home with some friends, and they needed the space in order to get ready for a homecoming dance. So of course, I'm now relegated to the bedroom where I'm going to finish these videos. But that's all right. We only have a couple videos left. For this video, we are going to turn our attention to environmental ethics and agricultural ethics. So remember that we've explored in various ways this notion of ecocentric perspectives, holistic ethics, and ecofeminism, as well as some other details related to these issues. And each of these seem to expand upon how we're understanding the moral community, expanding our moral concerns beyond mere individuals or even just animals to include things like the entire ecosystem, land, rivers, mountains, even the soil itself. So now that we've talked about all of that, I want to turn more directly to the relationship between environmental ethics and agriculture specifically. And that's because, as we saw previously, it turns out that agriculture is one of the biggest drivers for things like climate change, as well as a lot of other problems that we should be concerned with when we're thinking about environmental ethics. But at the same time, it's perhaps the system that most directly sustains human life, right? And so that's another reason why it's very important. Indeed, every decision that we make as a society, as individuals, with regard to how we farm, with regard to different ways in which we engage with agricultural practices, all of these carry very important ethical consequences, both for animals as well as ecosystems and for future generations that will come after us. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to consider this aspect of environmental ethics. So then, when you're thinking about agriculture as an environmental concern, it's easy to treat it as a technical or economic activity, right? So, how do we maximize a certain amount of yield? How do we minimize costs? How do we get the food that we eat to the market? Yet at the same time, philosophers go beyond all of these questions. Many philosophers argue that agriculture itself is ethically loaded, right? It's always, in some sense, an ethical practice. And this is because it shapes our ecosystems, it affects our soil and our health, it affects our water cycles as well as biodiversity. It shapes different human communities, the labor conditions that are involved with food access, especially for rural communities. It shapes the future and the sort of life that our children are going to have, what kind of land, what kind of water, what kind of climate future generations are going to inherit. So clearly, there are ethical considerations that philosophers are interested in as it relates to the practice of agriculture more generally. And so this is one of the reasons why agricultural ethics has become such an important field. It might be one of the reasons why you, as a person living in Nebraska, where agriculture is very important, it may be one of the reasons why you should pay attention to these issues. It brings environmental ethics, in a very important way down to earth. It brings it into the soil with regard to our farms. It brings it into the food systems that we depend upon, the water systems that we depend upon. And so, one of the things that we need to consider then is stewardship, right? That's one of the central ideas in good agricultural ethics, this idea of stewardship. Right, the word itself, it seems to suggest a kind of responsibility that we have. It suggests this intuitive idea that our responsibility is to steward the land, not merely to be an owner of the land, like some large corporation might be an owner of the land, but instead to be someone who is a caretaker of the land. Indeed, there are many religious traditions where this is a central idea, where humans are seen as stewards of the creation, where earth belongs to God and humans are in charge of caring for it and being responsible for it. Indeed, there are also secular contexts where stewardship means that farmers and policymakers and consumers all have a responsibility to manage the land and to be good stewards in the resources and the different ways in which these aspects of our life help sustain ourselves, help sustain our communities over the long run for future generations, not just for our immediate benefit. So then stewardship is a very important concept here. It's important because it reframes the different questions that we're asking. So instead of asking questions like, how much can I extract from the soil? How much can I produce in a certain year? Instead, stewardship is focused on questions like, how can we sustain what has been entrusted to us? How can we be a better caretaker of the land insofar as we are understanding the land and the water resources and the ecological systems to be all a part of the moral community just as much as you or I might be? Still, thinking about stewardship merely in terms of our responsibilities is not as straightforward as we might think it is. For example, we might wonder whether stewardship should focus mainly on sustaining food production for humans, or we might ask, should it be extended to protecting ecosystems for their own sake? What about the sorts of cases where human needs and the ecological health actually conflict? Where we might need to, damage an ecological system in order to make humans better off. Consider, for example, something like the soil. Healthy soil is alive in many different respects. Healthy soil has microorganisms, nutrients, and numerous different elements that help sustain the crops that we so desperately rely upon as a society. So when we consider things that involve heavy industrial farming practices, where we've got heavy tilling, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides, these can actually strip the soil of its vitality. So we might ask whether stewardship as an ethic would say, well, farmers have a responsibility to protect the soil, to protect the health of the soil, not just the production of this year's harvest, but rather for future decades and centuries to come. Or take, for instance, water use. Irrigation can make farming possible in dry regions, yet at the same time, overuse depletes aquifers that take thousands of years to recharge. So, stewardship, as a concept that's integral for agricultural practices, this forces us to ask questions like whether or not we've got enough drain water for reserves for short-term gain that might end up leaving future generations without access to the rainwater or to the water reserves that would be needed. So it's not merely focusing on how much can we produce in this year's crops. Instead, we need to think about future generations as well. And this brings us to a really important theme within our discussion of the ethics of agriculture. And that's essentially our ethical relationship or obligations that we might have to future generations. Some philosophers have given a label to this idea. Sometimes they call it intergenerational justice. But the basic idea is really quite simple. Our actions today are going to shape the conditions of life tomorrow. So future people can't vote and can't protest and can't speak up for themselves about what we are currently doing right now. And so that means it's going to fall on us to consider their interests since they're not even here yet. So this raises a number of very difficult questions. Do we owe future generations the same sort of moral considerations as we owe present generations, the people that are currently living? Or is our duty weaker, only maybe perhaps to avoid causing them some sort of catastrophic harm? Or perhaps we should balance our urgent needs today, like feeding the hungry, for instance, with the responsibilities that we have to preserve resources for future generations. Indeed, some philosophers have criticized our current practices and argued that when we fail to consider the needs and interests of future generations, that this is actually a form of a kind of moral blindness. So, in the same way that earlier societies often excluded women and enslaved various people from the kind of moral concerns that we typically attribute to most other people, then we also risk excluding future humans simply because they do not yet exist. And that might seem really problematic, morally speaking, insofar as we are failing to recognize their needs. So let's talk a little bit about our current food systems as it applies to future generations. And this will, I hope, help make this challenge quite tangible. Think about, for instance, climate change. Industrial agriculture contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. This is a known fact, right? So those emissions are going to shape the climate for future centuries. Or think about biodiversity, right? Once a species has actually gone extinct, future generations will never get the chance to experience or engage with them. In fact, Some of those species are you might think are needed, like for instance, bees are needed for pollination. So that might make a huge impact on the conditions that future generations experience. Or think about, for instance, land use. When we clear forests for agricultural purposes today, future generations will never be able to regenerate those sort of systems, altering ecosystems for millennia. So notice that here the ethical crux is that future generations will live with the consequences of our choices today. And they're never going to be able to reap the benefits of the food that we are currently eating now. And this creates a kind of asymmetry, a sort of asymmetry between the benefits we're receiving from agriculture and the food. Yet at the same time, future generations are going to be the ones that bear the cost of what we are doing today without sharing in any of the sorts of benefits or any of the gains that we are receiving. And of course, we can think about this issue in terms of different normative theories, and it looks like once again they're all going to converge on the same conclusion. For instance, a utilitarian might argue that we need to maximize well-being, not just for us in the present, not just presently living people, but for everyone who will ever live, meaning that future generations should be able to benefit from agriculture as well, and future generations count equally and in the same way that we count. The future generations, even though they don't currently exist, their interests and their suffering, their well-being is just as morally important as ours. Or somebody who's persuaded by Kantian deontology, someone like that might say that we have a moral duty not to use resources in a way that's going to violate the rights of these future people, right? Because when we do so, we would be treating them as mere objects or mere tools for our own benefit without respecting their own rationality, their own personhood. So both of these normative theories, it looks like, are going to converge on the same point that we must take future generations into consideration when we're thinking about our agricultural practices. So, for instance, I want you to consider this point. Imagine that you are a current policymaker. Let's say that you're in Congress, or maybe you're just a part of the Nebraska State Senate, and you're trying to make a decision about some law that's going to be passed, where your decision affects whether to allow heavy irrigation of farmland that will ultimately dramatically increase food yields. That's going to be good. It's going to increase food yields for the next, let's say, 20 years, but will also drain an aquifer that will harm future generations well beyond 20 years, future generations that might need that water. So then what will stewardship require in that sort of case? Do we owe it to future generations to restrict current irrigations, even if that means producing less food now? These are the sorts of questions that I want you to think about, especially as we continue to look at the different issues related to agricultural through the perspective of environmental ethics, where we focus on intergenerational justice. Because next time, in the next video, we're going to consider three dominant sort of main normative theories, which are utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And we're going to look at those views, provide different frameworks for thinking about agricultural in the environment. So that's what we're going to do in the next video.